Wow, and New York Times bestseller. That's right?
I'm as surprised as anyone.
And you were just selected by the Financial Times as one of the top books of the year as well. So you're on a roll.
It's a little creepy.
Well, so, but let me just ask you about the book for a minute because I've written a couple books myself, six, not bragging. Okay, I am bragging. But what I thought was interesting just in reading your book, I don't, and I'm not complaining, but to me, it's a remarkable book in that the whole thing, and it's 480 pages, it's you talking essentially the whole time. You don't quote anyone else that I can find in the book. That's unusual in any kind of a nonfiction book. That I mean, it's not that your facts aren't right, but did you dictate the book? I mean, I'm just curious about the mechanics of the book itself because it's you giving one long 500-page lecture, and that to me is unusual. Tell me about that.
It's definitely unusual. I'm neither a journalist nor an academic. My background is in private intelligence. So it's all been about taking huge amounts of information and distilling it down in order to figure out what's going on and how, when one thing changes, things on the other side of the world react. As a result, the whole of human history is my input. And if I were to cite everything that had some contribution to what I thought, the citations would be a lot more than 480 pages. So I
Right.
mean, I'm literally standing on the shoulders of not just giants who came before. I'm standing on the shoulders of everyone.
Well, so let's talk about that because I also did a little homework. You're from Marshalltown, Iowa, and your folks I just saw had celebrated their 50th anniversary. Am I remembering this right?
Oh, they're up to like 53 now.
Oh, okay. So that was a few years ago, and then you graduated from Truman State University. What is it now known as Truman State, Northeast Missouri State University? Right. This is. I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but that's in a lot of people in your business, in a lot of the geopolitical people, they're Ivy League types, East Coast types. You're not part of that. I mean, how did
Hate Washington so much. I lived there for 10 months. It was about 9.5 months too much. Uh,
but you know
Nothing
what I'm
against the
but you know what
people.
I'm but you know what I'm talking about.
I
That
totally
you're
get it. Yeah, no, I mean, most people who deal with international affairs in the United States, like myself, started out in DC, and most of them stay there because it's all about influencing the government or being part of the State Department or whatever else. I never went that route. As a rule, if you're in Washington, you have to be there for 20, 30, 40 years before you kind of get your first piece of the pie, so to speak. And then you're responsible for a very, very narrow sliver. The only way to get to the position where you can actually have influence over a lot of things is to become Secretary of State. And that requires you to be part of a political campaign. And I knew in my 20s that was never going to happen. So I went into the private sector and fell in with a company that did geopolitical analysis. And I was really the only generalist they had ever hired. Everyone else was an area specialist. And so I did time in all of the regions. And as a result, most of the clients liked me because most analysts are kind of jerks. They try to make everything about what they know. And as a generalist, I was willing to interface with the clients and learn from them as well as the other way around. And so when I left, I had kind of built this map of how everything fits together, and I just took the map with me.
and that firm was here in Austin, Stratfor, if I'm remembering
Yes.
correctly. Right. Okay. Well, so enough about you. Let's talk about China because it seems to me, and you warn about China in the book. You talk about China and demographics, but in the last few days, the situation there seems to have become even more inflamed. How do you have a recent YouTube video in which you talk about this, and you're producing YouTube videos all the time as well. What's your take on what happens now? Because it sure looks like they're rolling back some of the COVID rules. Is China unraveling in real time here in front of our eyes? What do you see?
When you're dealing with a cult of personality system like China, you got to be a little cautious at making bold forecasts because we just don't have all the information we need to know one way or the other. But that said, there seem to be two things at play. When you have a system that is as tightly controlled as the Chinese system has been historically and is now, things go one of two directions. Number one, cult of personality means that the buck starts and stops with one dude. And it doesn't matter how smart he is, he's never going to be good enough to manage anything. And certainly not everything, because he can only work through people who are sycophants. Everyone else who is intelligent has been purged from the system a long time ago. And in that sort of environment, once people start to challenge the government in any form, it rapidly spreads to challenging the government and everything. And so, since last Thursday, when the fire in Urumqi happened and these protests started, we have already seen the protests expand dramatically to not just be about COVID, but to be about democracy versus dictatorship. And we're seeing Winnie the Pooh holding up blank sheets of paper, which is kind of representation of, or you don't really know what you're doing anymore. It's become personal in a week. And if that is allowed to continue, it will spin the entire system apart. And Chinese history is replete with examples of how everything collapses in a matter of weeks and months. This could be one of those. Option two, Xi, one-man show, cult of personality, locks everything down in order to get it all back under political control, in which case any sort of economic dynamism dies very quickly. So neither of these scenarios are good for China as a country or good for China as an economic entity. And don't forget that COVID's in play here. The current strain of COVID is more communicable than the measles and 5 times as fatal. And we just had several hundred super spreader events.
And their vaccines don't work.
They don't work at all. So if they don't go into an immediate nationwide series of lockdowns, we are talking literally about hundreds of thousands to millions of deaths a month, concentrating what the United States did in 3 years into a very short period of time because we were exposed in stages. And half of our exposure happened after the vaccines came out. That's not what's going on here.
Well, so damn. So either way, what you're what you're predicting, what I'm hearing you say is that China is facing a precipitous fall either way they go, and that is going to have ramifications across the global economy because it's so important in terms of supply chains, demand for oil. I mean, could this result then in a global recession or global crash, and particularly in commodity prices because of China's role as a massive consumer of everything from crude to tin and aluminum?
Well, I mean, to set China aside for just a second,
Yeah.
so many things are going wrong all at the same time. As soon as we got to the end of the Obama years and it was clear that the Americans were done maintaining globalization, first Trump, now Biden, we've always known we were going to get here. And on the China relationship, we've always known we were going to get here, whether it was because of ethics or genocide or jobs or trade security or intellectual property theft or fascism or race, whatever method you want to use to evaluate. We've always known that the bilateral relationship was going to collapse, whether it was going to be because of something on our side, something on their side, something in between. We always known it was going away. And we've always known that China was going to go away. Their demographics are the most terminal on the planet and in history. The birth rate in Shanghai and Beijing are the lowest ever recorded, and they just got revised down another 20% in the last 2 months. We now have a birth rate in China that in the last 6 years has dropped by 70%. And the Chinese are now admitting that they overcounted their population by over 100 million people, and all the missing millions are under age 40. So this was already a country in full demographic collapse that was going to cease to exist this decade. Everything that's happening now with Xi and COVID is just on top of that.
Well, let me ask you specifically about this recent event because I've watched it many times, and to me, and I've talked about it with some other people, but it was at the Communist Party Congress, and they escorted Hu Jintao out of the building, right?
Yeah.
And I watched it so I don't know, 10, maybe 15 times because reading the facial gestures and reading how dismissive Xi was of Hu and Hu's own kind of surprise that, wait, what is happening here? And it was a purge in real time on television, right? How significant was that? Because I thought there's a movie script just to be written just in that 2 minutes of video. I thought it was just riveted by it. How did you see that?
Well, let me give you the quick background so you can understand the significance.
Okay.
After Mao's disaster and the Cultural Revolution and the broad-scale destruction that generated, Deng Xiaoping was brought in, and he basically helped put the pieces together and came to a working agreement with the United States to join the globalized system. And as he was in his final years as ruler, he selected 2 relatively middle-of-the-road bureaucrats who were technocrats from different factions to succeed him. First, it was Deng Xiaoping. No, wait. Sorry, it's been a while. Jiang Zemin. Wow, sorry, I just got done talking to a different audience, so I've got different facts in my head. Uh, uh, Jiang Zemin, and then Hu Jintao. And so they both ruled for 10 years. Zhang is from Shanghai, Hu is from the Beijing area, different factions, different geographies. The whole idea was to get a balance. But back when he did this, Deng knew that he couldn't look forward enough to figure out who was going to be there for the next 10 years. So he left it those two factions that he did choose to select who the compromise candidate would be for number 5. And that ended up being Xi. So when Xi comes in, he recognizes that he's a compromise candidate, and he feels the need to break both factions as well as all of the others to make sure that no one can challenge him. So he called it an anti-corruption campaign effort that dominated his first 5-year term, in which he got rid of everybody he saw as problematic. And then in the second 5 years, he went after the factions themselves to make sure that they could not function independently of him. And in this, Hu Jintao was broadly supportive. And by the time we got to the third party Congress last month, he was the only one left. And so the symbolism of taking somebody who actually supported you, but was the last semi-independent pole of power within the entire system, and publicly melon scooping them from the political discourse, that was powerful. And it started what has now become a race among the sycophants within the current government of who can prove themselves to be more loyal. And as a result, we are seeing policy collapses across the entire political system. And COVID is just one representation of that. We're seeing this in relations with Russia, in relations with the United States. We're seeing this in the power sector. We're seeing it in the financial sector. We're seeing it in housing. I mean, the whole system is shaking apart. And I got to admit, it's kind of entertaining to watch.
Entertaining, but damn scary, isn't it? I mean,
totally scary, but I don't live in China.
Well, and I want to come back to why you're bullish on the U.S. I am as well. In my last book, my 5th book, I talk about why the U.S. has so many advantages, right? Geographic, demographic, et cetera. We'll come back to that. But just cast this forward in terms of commodities, and because China has been such a massive absorber of every kind of commodity around the world and a massive exporter of labor intensive goods, including Apple iPhones. What does this mean for Apple? Let's start with them.
Oh, well, Apple's totally screwed in the midterm. Apple is the American company that has refused to see the writing on the wall. And every time there has been a hiccup in relationships, whether it's the trade fight starting under Obama, getting serious under Trump, getting codified under Biden, whether it's warrior wolf diplomacy, genocide, Hong Kong, whatever it happens to be, Apple has doubled down. And now 91% of their supply chain is dependent upon mainland China in some way. And so we are looking at Apple as an institution, as a firm, ceasing to have a product set for several years until they can rebuild that supply chain somewhere else. Now, if this had been a normal company, I would say that this would be the end of the firm, but Apple has like $18 bajillion saved up right now. They can afford to go out and rebuild their supply chain in other places, but that's not something you do in 2, 3, or 4 years. So we're probably done with iPhones until around 2028.
Say that again.
It's going to take them 5 to 6 years to rebuild the supply chain system.
And so I mean, there were some of these demonstrations were focused right around Foxconn, which was their biggest supplier, right? And Apple was trying to quell this, I
mean, there's a reason why Tim Cook is not saying anything about this, because there's nothing he can say that can fix this. They just need to rebuild the entire manufacturing supply chain elsewhere, almost completely from scratch.
And we're talking about the most valuable. Well, I don't know whether Saudi Aramco, what their market cap is, but we're talking about the most valuable company in the world here.
Yeah. They screwed up badly.
So let's talk about when we set up this interview. And when we talked here in Austin, I said I wanted to talk to you about China. Well, now China has really interrupted the queue, but we also talked about Mexico, and you talk about Mexico in the book as being the most important trading partner for the U.S. for the coming decades. I live in Texas. I know you used to live here in Austin, and I've been to the border. I've been to Mexico a few times, not recently. And we talked, in fact, when you were here in Austin, about Mexico as a failed state. And in some ways it is a failed state, but you also point out that it also has many advantages, including demographics and obviously proximity to the U.S. NAFTA. Talk about Mexico, or reprise, if you don't mind, what you talked about in the book, but also how you see Mexico now, as its importance with the collapsing of China only then grown greater then since the book came out. How do you talk about Mexico?
Absolutely. I mean, let's start with the big shocking thing. In terms of value add, if you compare the value of things that Mexico starts working with to what they actually finish in their exports, they're the highest value add economy in the world. They've got a workforce that is larger and better skilled and with a better industrial plant than the entirety of Central Europe already. Now, there are a lot of things about Donald Trump I am not a fan of, but NAFTA 2, negotiated in the way that it was, implemented in the way that it was a stroke of genius. It was very, very well done. And in most economic sectors, Mexico is already one of our top three trading partners. And overall, they officially passed China this past year to become our number one trading partner. And that's a position they are unlikely to give up in our lifetimes. In terms of manufacturing, because that's where it gets really sexy, we have offshored our industry a lot because of globalization. And the Chinese have taken full advantage of that by design, because we brought the Chinese into the anti-Soviet coalition during the Cold War. And having the Chinese subsidize, basically pay us to buy their stuff, that was a great deal if you were involved in anything except for American manufacturing. Well, now with the Chinese system breaking down and the Mexican system really hitting its stride, a lot of this stuff was already coming back. Mexican workers are very high value add. American workers are very high value add. And with energy and commodity prices all over the place for the last decade, incrementally, we have already been going through the fastest industrialization process in American history. Part of that's the shale revolution. But now that China is experiencing tectonic problems, we should expect the pace of this to accelerate considerably, because we are now in a position where we are likely to lose manufactured goods out of Germany and China at the same time at scale. And so Americans have a very simple choice to make. We can have high inflation and not have goods, or we can build our own industrial plant with the Mexicans and have the fastest economic growth in our history. I mean, this is not a hard decision to make.
Well, you made that point when you were here in Austin as well, talking about the fact that the German industry is decamping for the U.S. and BASF is one of those companies, right? The biggest chemical maker in Europe, one of the biggest in the
Well,
world.
and BASF is not just important because it's huge. It's important because it produces the base material that allows all other German manufacturing to happen. Without the Russian natural gas coming in any longer, BASF knows that its economic viability within Germany is already over, and so they're relocating everything they can to primarily Louisiana, because that's where the natural gas is. But
Right.
that won't save the rest of Germany.
They announced well, just in the last 4 or 5 months, two expansions of their facility in Geismar, Louisiana, which was one of those, right? And then Volkswagen just in the last few days saying, "Oh yeah, we're not going to build batteries here. Forget it. We're out. We're going to go build these batteries somewhere else." And it was the CEO of the Volkswagen brand said it's not just batteries; it's any energy intensive material. So that but just to repeat, you're saying the deindustrialization of China and or Germany together then only accelerate the ties between U.S. and Mexico. So what about Canada? Canada is not going to be as important. It's a third of the size of Mexico, roughly. Talk about Canada then for a moment, if you don't mind.
I don't want to suggest for a moment that Canada doesn't matter at all. Let me rephrase that. I totally love suggesting that Canada doesn't matter. uh, but the key thing to remember about the United States-Mexico relationship is we have different skill sets. We're good at different things. We're good at different price points. And whenever you're doing a manufacturing system, you need different labor skill sets at different price points. And the border region is perfect for that. Canada, not so much. Canada's quality of work is very similar to the United States. Their cost of labor is very similar to the United States. And so Ontario can integrate with the lower 48 like it was a 49th state, and that's not nothing. But the room for growth is limited because it's not taking advantage of a dramatic change in the international environment like Mexico will be. Canada is simply an already integrated part of the American economy. Mexico is filling a need that we haven't had until very recently.
And they have the labor.
Yes.
and Canada not so much, right? Their
Canada's
population
kind of
rates are
topped out.
right.
The only way we get fresh labor into the Canadian system is immigration, and they're the world's leader at attracting immigrants on a per capita basis. But they're also on a bit of a treadmill because they bring in people in their 30s and their 40s who drop a lot of cash, buy some property, distort the local markets, and then, especially recently, move on. So we've had a huge amount of Chinese capital go in and distort Canada to the point that a lot of people in Canada can't, or sorry, a lot of people who were born in Canada can't afford to live in Canada. But the Chinese that come in are dropping their money but not working there. So they're getting all of the distortions and none of the advantages to the labor market.
So it's somewhat similar to the Chinese decamping for Australia, right? They're buying expensive real
Would agree.
estate
Yeah.
in Sydney, but in Canada it's in
Yeah, the same
Vancouver.
thing happened in New Zealand. And so the Kiwis and the Canadians have now barred foreign purchases of their property. Australia and the United States at the present have not done that. So we're going to be seeing a little bit more concentration of that kind of distortion in some of the gateway markets.
Gotcha. So, we've covered Mexico then, but actually, I want to ask about we talked about this when you were here in Austin, just briefly. It has hallmarks of a failed state because of the narco problem, right?
Yeah,
And
no. I would argue at least half of that is our problem because we really love our cocaine in this country. And
yeah,
as long as that is the case, there is going to be a smuggling route for the cocaine to get in. And the cartels are a very serious threat, and they're becoming more serious. So the background. The Sinaloa cartel has been the most powerful organized crime group in the world for several years, and they have crossed north of the border. And under the Obama administration, they were identified as public enemy number one. And El Chapo, their leader, became our most wanted person. And after a lot of back and forth with the Mexicans, we captured him. He escaped. We captured him again. And now he's serving out multiple lifetime prisons. He'll never see the light of day again. And the Sinaloa cartel is starting to disintegrate. In many ways, that's a problem because under El Chapo, it was run as a business. Cocaine smuggling is what they did. And so you didn't engage in side businesses. You did not corrupt local government. You did not shoot the locals or rob the locals because that would encourage people to turn against you. With El Chapo gone, that's kind of fallen apart. It's become a lot more violent, starting to fracture. And a new faction, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, is rising up, and it is hyper violent. And the first thing they do when they move into a town is shoot a bunch of people, and they run cocaine on the side. They are in the process of challenging the other cartels for control of all the plaza access points on the border. And if they manage to successfully cross at just one of them, well, then white chicks named Debbie and Dallas are going to get shot. And our view of Mexico and the drug war is going to change dramatically in a very short period of time.
you said cocaine, but it also fentanyl and opioids. I mean, this is the other big part of the influx of contraband from Mexico into the U.S.
Yeah, I don't mean
And
to suggest that those are not important. They
yeah,
are, but the sourcing for that is very broad based. The Mexican cartels are only part of the constellation for the supply of those.
gotcha. So, but to bring it back to that idea about then the violence and I've watched it from a distance. I don't speak of any of this firsthand, but it just seems that this violence and the lack of rule of law, or to put it a different way, the strength of the cartels in many of the provinces in Mexico, this is a problem. But you're saying that the maquila industry and the other industries that are industrial that are going to be important to trade for the U.S. can be somewhat immune from that failed part of the Mexico state. Is that a fair way to put it?
Immune might be a bit strong. Part of the problem we're facing with the
Insulated, maybe.
Yeah, degree insulated. Part of the problem with the cartels is that in northern Mexico and in southern Mexico, you've got a topography that is relatively difficult for governments to control. So in the north, you've got a highland desert. In the south, you've got tropics. It's just difficult for states to push their writ in areas like that. That's one of the reasons why central Mexico has, as a rule, been less violent. In that sort of environment, especially when the cartels consider drug running to be their primary source of income, there's nothing that says that it has to overlap with traditional routes. Because if you've got one guy with a backpack with 20 pounds of coke, that's a lot of cash. He doesn't need a container to do that. You can have the two operating side by side with a degree of insulation, and the violence itself is usually never more than 1 or 2% of the physical land area of the country at any given time. So if you got a
Mm.
security team with your operation who knows how to keep their ears to the ground, they can figure out what's coming and when to shut down and who not to deal with, and it can be managed. The challenge moving forward is if Jalisco really does get control of a plaza, the plazas are where the licit goods transfer through, and that's too close. El
And
Chapo and the Sinaloa use those, but they don't interfere with trade because they realize it would be bad for their business. El Mencho and the New Generation cartel would probably have a very different operating strategy.
And when you're talking about the plaza, you're talking about the Zocalo, the center of the town. You're talking about that they wouldn't operate, the cartels won't be on the fringe of
Well,
town. They'll be
specifically the trade arteries where they cross the border.
okay. So the plazas you're talking about, okay. So the access points to get into Texas or into California would be
Correct.
the choke points. What you're saying? So if they control or start to control those border points, then it's a different story.
Yeah. Right now, they're contested, and most of the violence, almost all the violence, is on the south side of the border. But if they do seize control of one and they have unrestricted access to the United States, that would threaten trade. Now, when you've got a cartel with one dude at the top who's calling all the shots, it's kind of like what's going on in China. If Xi were to die tomorrow, you would have national disintegration in a short period of time because there's no other source of authority. The same with Jalisco New Generation. So if El Mincho were to slip in the shower and fall on some bullets tomorrow, the forecast change.
Fall on some just
Happens.
slip and having to be executed by an AK-47. Yeah, well, that's an unfortunate shower event. The other key theme we talked about here in Austin, but is also a key theme in your book, is the idea of the Blue Water Navy and the U.S. Navy and its importance to global trade. I had another guest on the podcast, and now I'm bringing it up, and of course I'm forgetting his name. Right, Easterbrook, his book on the Blue Water Navy in the U.S. was really important and talked about the evolution of the U.S. Navy. One of your thesis points that you're talking about in the book is that the Navy is no longer going to be the cop of the global oceans. Has anything changed since in the interim to make you think that Congress is going to appropriate enough money for the Navy to have more than 300 ships that would bolster the Navy to bring it back? What's your thinking on that lately?
No, and even if Congress did, it wouldn't matter. So, if you want to patrol the ocean blue for commerce in an environment where you are not the only Navy, you're going to need about 800 destroyers. We've got 70. So, the naval buildup that would be required if that's a role we want to play is simply beyond something we could do in anything less than a 50-year time frame. So, I suggest you put that out of your mind. Also, at the end of the Cold War, we decided to concentrate our Navy in terms of combat power into the supercarrier battle groups, of which we now have 11. And those are great for knocking off countries, but they're horrible for patrolling because they can only be in 11 places at one time, assuming they're all deployed. So even if we wanted to, we are now technically incapable of patrolling the global oceans. That doesn't mean that we're giving up the Navy, not even remotely. Our Navy is conservatively 8 times as powerful as everyone else's combined. And the world's second and third most powerful blue water navies are Japan and the United Kingdom. So, those three countries in terms of naval cooperation get along the best of any three navies in the world. So that 8 to 1, if anything, is probably closer to 15 to 1. But that is designed for combat power. It is no longer designed for global patrol.
So when you talk about that, you're specifically talking about piracy then, and the ability of the Navy to stop piracy on the high seas, like offshore Somalia or other places like that?
Call
Is
it
that where?
piracy. If a government is involved, call it state piracy or privateering. But yeah, we should expect to see a lot more of all of that.
So I had a little brain mishap there, but the book is The Blue Age: How the U.S. Navy Created Global Prosperity by Greg Easterbrook. He puts forward a similar thesis that the importance of the U.S. Navy is hard to overstate in terms since World War II, which is a point that you make as well in your
Totally
book.
agree.
But followed through on that. So is it going to be China being more active or belligerent in the South China
Nope.
Sea? What
China
is it?
might have 600 ships versus ours, but most of them are very, very small, and only 10% of them can sail more than 1,000 miles from the coast. And honestly, it's not even that good because that 1,000 miles assumes that they're going in a straight line and slow to save fuel. If they're actually maneuvering like you would in war, they can maybe go 350 miles from shore. It's a coastal navy. It is not a regional, much less a global one. And the country that is most dependent upon the Americans keeping the trade lanes open is China. So if they were to do anything so stupid as to challenge the US Navy, we would just park a couple of destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin, cut the energy line from the Persian Gulf, and the China would collapse as a modern state within 6 months. This would not be a hard war if it came to it.
Well, so then who's the challenge? I mean, where is this piracy? Where is this going to privateering?
Everywhere
From where will it
is the
come?
answer, because the Americans are no longer supporting the system, and so you're going to get regional powers, whether out of desperation or opportunity, looking after their own affairs in their own ways. In the case of the Persian Gulf, that means the Saudis are probably the greater threat to the Persian Gulf than the Iranians are. We're seeing what's going on in the Black Sea with the Russians right now. And what does Europe look like in a post-German system? We've seen this movie before. It is not good for commerce.
So then what's the way forward then? If I mean, because you're painting if one of the macro themes of the book is that we're going to see a lot of reshoring, and this is going to be good for the US. And there's a point you made during your speech here in Austin that this longer term is going to accrue to the benefit of the US, which I think is likely true because of demographics, energy supply, geography. Geography is destiny, a point you make over and over. But then who are going to be the big rivals then if China is falling, then who and Russia is weak now, who are going to be the principal rivals then for the US in terms of this next wave of growth? Is it going to be Vietnam? Who
Well,
would
the
that be?
primer on that is book number 3. That's Disunited Nations. And
Okay.
in that, I break down the countries of the future as we think of them now and explain why they're really mostly failed places and who the countries of the future are going to be. And we're going to have a series of regional powers that are capable of kind of creating a bubble of security in their own neighborhood. France in Western Europe, Argentina in South America, Japan in East Asia, and Turkey in the Levant. Of those 4, since the book came out, the Japanese have found a way to cut a series of deals with the United States, both under Trump and now under Biden. And so basically, we're seeing a fusing of the theoretical Japanese sphere of influence with the greater NAFTA system. And I think before we get too far into this, the Brits are probably going to come along for the party as well. So you'll have a kind of a super system based in the Western Hemisphere that the Americans reign over, for lack of a better phrase, that we have the 2 secondary naval powers of the world that are participating in. And then you'll have these smaller chunks that have kind of melon scooped out their own neighborhood. And the zones in between them just become no man's lands.
Well, let's talk about the UK then, because I'm looking at the UK and following, what's happening, particularly on the energy side there. They look to me, I don't want to get too technical here, but totally screwed. I mean, just totally screwed, right?
You're being very charitable.
They haven't drilled. The heyday of the North Sea is long past, 15 or more years in terms of gas production. They now import more than half of their natural gas. Their electricity prices are through the roof. We're seeing deindustrialization happening in Britain as fast or faster than anywhere else in on the European continent. And yet you're pointing to you, as I'm hearing you, am I hearing you correctly, that you're still bullish on Britain over the long term?
Over the long term, I mean, they have to kind of get their heads out of their asses first. So when the vote on Brexit happened, they neglected to imagine what their next step was. They believed, the Brexiteers believed a little bit of their own propaganda that they could just come to Washington and get a better deal than they got with the EU. And when they tried that under Trump, they discovered it was not true. And in order to get a free trade deal with the United States, they basically had to sacrifice control of their financial, manufacturing, and agricultural system. On January 5th of 2021, they swallowed their pride and like, okay, fine, we'll sign. And they sent their emissary over to sign deals on January 6th. And other things were in play on January 6th. And then
Right.
Biden comes in, and Biden is not nearly as pro free trade as Trump was. So it's in the wind still. Basically, Britain has done what has happened to Britain is what it always feared. It has devolved into a middle power that doesn't have any leverage. And until such time as they accept that, like the Japanese, they've got to cut humiliating deals with both the left and the right in the United States. And it's got to be the same deal until they accept that. They're kind of stuck in this no man's land. And it's difficult for them to leverage what they do have to reshape their future. And in the meantime, everything that they had about the old European system is falling apart piece by piece with increasing speed. And that leaves them in the lurch they're in now.
I mean, this could be it could be very uncomfortable and destabilizing, couldn't it? I mean, we're already seeing, if the projections are for energy poverty even this winter, or if we look at next winter,
Yeah,
where
and the
you're
more
having,
desperate the situation is, the faster we will get to a political reckoning in London, which will lead them in time to admit that their only future is as part of the NAFTA system. But they've got to get there at their own pace. But reality is pushing them there very quickly.
what is that line that a friend of mine put it? They need some market therapy. Was that the,
Well, I mean, the markets have been very kind to the UK to this point. They've taken 6 years to make a decision. And it wasn't until just this past year that the markets are really like, we're kind of done waiting.
right? Which was why we saw the pound fall so far. And then
Now, don't get me wrong, Liz Truss made some mistakes,
right.
but that was the culmination of 6 years of mistakes.
Let's talk about trust for a minute, because I wrote a piece recently in Real Clear Energy about, I think it was there, I've forgotten where I published it, but about Rishi Sunak coming in and reversing Truss's ban on, or lifting the ban on hydraulic fracturing. It's like they can't figure out what is in their own interest, and they have enormous shale resources, but they have to drill and they have to frack, and yet here was a Tory leader Truss saying, we're going to repeal the ban. And then Sunak, she's only in power for 6 weeks. Sunak comes in, immediately reverses course. How are you ever going to develop shale gas in Britain if you have the Tories saying we won't drill?
Well, one, we haven't had the political break that'll force all of this to be reshaped yet. And in that sort of environment, it is at the moment in the UK politically unpopular to frack. And it's not so much the technology, it's the land ownership issues,
Right.
because the government owns all the subsoil rights. And so if somebody comes into your house and says, I'm going to frack in your backyard and you don't get a cent from it, obviously you're going to be opposed. You do that in the United States, you get royalties.
Right. Yeah. No, that's right. And they're having the similar conflict over onshore wind and in Britain as well, which is something I've written a lot about, the conflicts over land use and wind and solar siting. In Austin, when I heard you speak here, you said, I'm quoting, I think pretty much directly, you said, we could easily have 150 to $180 per barrel crude. And you talked about the January 1st, the sanctions expand and prohibit any Russia. Well, I guess it's the insurance issue on Russian vessels that are carrying Russian goods. Um, Talk about that if you would, please. Why do you expect higher oil prices, and what are these sanctions effect on Russia? Why are those kicking in? When they kick in, why will it have such a big effect?
So, in a normal energy project, when the price drops too much, they shut in production.
Right.
And then they restart it later. And no one likes to do that. It costs something, it costs time, and you're not getting income in the meantime, but it can be done. But you can't do that in the Russian permafrost. If the crude stops moving through the permafrost layer for any reason, it freezes into gel, and the water that comes up as a byproduct freezes into ice. And when water turns into ice, it expands and it pops the pipe from the inside. What's going on right now is the insurance ban on Russian vessels on January 1 will expand to any vessel carrying any Russian cargo. And at the same time, the Europeans are about to enact their ban, saying that no Russian crude whatsoever can be sold by any boat to any European market. And that is going to force a degree of shut in the ports. The pressure will build back up to the wells, and then the wells will freeze solid. That's going to happen pretty quick. And since the demand for energy tends to be inelastic, you get an outsized price response. So, assuming for the moment that all else is equal, and I realize that is never true, you remove 4 million barrels a day of Siberian output, and you're going to get $180 oil. Now, that was my forecast when I saw you last time. Since then, the Chinese look like they're going out of their way to experience an economic crisis. And if we see a drastic decrease in their ability to absorb crude, that's going to change the price forecast. There's so
Sure.
much in motion right now, but none of it is great.
Well, so then let me follow that up then. So it's a question I have asked of a lot of guests, and you're long the U.S. That you've made that very clear. I am as well. I'm a homer of the first order here. But where does a smart investor then put money these days? Is it, I've had people, gold bugs, and, we see what's happening in crypto. You have a chapter, and I've heard you talk about the US dollar. It's still, for all of its flaws, being the best currency in a terrible global neighborhood of currencies. So where are you putting your 401k?
I'm not a CFA, so let's keep that in mind. This is not
Well,
investment advice.
I understand. Well, all of the podcast listeners here know to take everything with a big ass grain of salt. But anyway,
Absolutely.
where do you put your 401k money then, Peter?
I like companies that center their production and their sales in North America because we've got the highest value added labor system between Mexico and the United States, and we produce where we sell for the most part. Also, if the product is demographically driven in terms of its demand profile, I like that. And if the end product is very energy intensive for its production, because we have the cheapest electricity and energy in the world, that's great. And if the end product is exportable, that's kind of like my trifecta. And so, agricultural processing, petrochemicals, things like that are most of my portfolio. Since the Ukraine war started, I have gotten into commodities in a very big way, but I will caution you that most players in most commodity markets are truly global. And you want to make sure you are not exposed to Ukraine or Russia or Brazil because the Russian system is fallen apart. The Ukrainian system is unlikely to come back, and Brazil is dependent upon material inputs that come from Russia. So you've got to be very, very careful where you're putting your money in that space, or you're going to get exposed to all the bad along with the good.
So when you're talking about Brazil and Russia, you're talking. One of my previous guests on the podcast is Chris Lawson from the CRG group. I'm sorry, he's a fertilizer expert, but he was talking about exports of fertilizer, particularly from Russia. So you're talking about Brazil's reliance on Russia as an export market, but also Brazil as an importer of Russian fertilizer, potash, nitrogen, et cetera.
I don't have the data in front of me, but on the whole, roughly 40 to 50% of Brazilian fertilizer inputs are sourced from the former Soviet Union, and most of the remainder is either China or the Middle East. So there's no version of this picture that looks good for Brazil.
Well, let's talk about food then, because you talked about ag commodities, and I'm thinking in my head soybeans, corn. You've in the last chapter of your book, I think you call it the third horseman. I think it is the long ride of the third horseman, and you mentioned it here in your presentation here in Austin at the Secured Finance Network. Your outlook in terms of food supplies and famine is sobering. Let me,
Yeah.
is that sobering a good word for your outlook?
That's a very calm way to put it.
And so walk me through why you are
Sure. Well, let me make
expecting
this a little
famine.
bit more broad.
Okay.
So, most of the economic growth that the world, not the US, the world has experienced since 1990 is that we've brought in an empire worth of raw materials from the Russian space. And we've brought in a billion workers from the Chinese space. And the outputs from both of those systems have allowed Brazil to bloom in a way that it never could before. We're now seeing all of that in reverse. And if you remove a lot of the added fertilizer that's come into the situation, then the 2.5 billion people that we have added since 1990 are in some very real danger because Brazil is the world's second largest agricultural exporter. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat. Ukraine is number five, and Canadian, excuse me, Chinese capital has been part of what's made this all work. And we've seen an increase of the Chinese lifespan by over 40%, 50% since 1990. These things are all linked together. And when you take away the food supply that has allowed all of this to happen, we get to a very dark place very, very quickly. And you cannot replace fertilizer supplies quickly. Nitrogen and phosphate take a minimum of 3 years. Potash usually takes 10. And so far, we've only lost roughly 1/3 of the former Soviet Union's output of this stuff. And that has already been enough for almost every producer in the world to have gone through all of their reserves. The only reason we're not in a food crisis already is because people had reserves and Mother Nature was very, very kind to us this past year. There's no way we're going to repeat that next year.
And it's simply because of Russia's outsized role. I think Chris Lawson said they account for something like 20 or 30% of the waterborne trade in fertilizers, right? And if the sanctions are going to affect that, but he said at that point that the Russian sanctions hadn't touched the fertilizer market. Are there sanctions going to hit if you what you said before? Any Russian ship carrying Russian goods can't be insured. That takes all that fertilizer out of the
We're in this
marketplace.
weird situation where the Biden administration is trying to provide letters of comfort to point out to financiers and shippers that these things are not under sanctions in order to limit the damage. But if you're a financial house and you see these sanctions getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and with every new genocide that the Russians propagate, you got to wonder whether you want to be affiliated at all. So, most to this point of the reduction in fertilizer shipments, roughly one third, has been because companies don't want to touch it, not because they're under sanction. What's going to happen over the next years, we're starting to see industrial accidents in a lot of these places because most of the technology, most of the infrastructure that produces this stuff dates back to the 60s. And it's only been held together since 1990 with Western duct tape and technical work and people shoehorning parts into it. That's not happening anymore. So in the natural gas sector, we're literally seeing explosions at gas processing facilities that you can see from space. And fertilizers, in many ways, is a derivative of petrochemicals, especially for nitrogen. And because natural gas is caught up in the Russia European mix, the Europeans have stopped making it at all. So it's not all just a direct interruption of Russian and Belarusian shipments. So we're seeing pressure throughout the entire supply chain in the former Soviet and European space. And we're only at the beginning of that.
Well, so then walk us through, so get your crystal ball out then, and what happens to Russia then? Does Putin end up with a bullet in the back of his head, or dragged through the streets like Muammar Gaddafi? What I mean, to me, it
If
seems to me.
Putin were to die tomorrow, I don't think it would change the course of the war. The clique that runs the Russian system broadly sees the world from the same point of view as Putin. And so you might get a difference in style, but I don't think you get any difference in the real approach to the conflict, and I don't think the war would end. The question to ask is whether or not Russia is going to win or lose this, and we don't know yet. We will know in May and June because
Right.
we're at a bit of an operational pause right now because the Ukrainians are assimilating a lot of Russian gear that they've caught, that they've captured. They've captured almost twice as much gear from the Russians in the last 3 months as they started the war with, in addition to everything that's coming from NATO. So by the time they're done with that process in the beginning of May, the Ukrainian military will have 5 times the capacity of what it started the war with. That's just incredible. At the same
And this
time, the
is due
Russians are
and
going to
this
be
is due in
throwing a
large part.
half a million to a million more men into the war as well. So it's going to be a very different war. But May is when mud season is over and they can all maneuver and get at each other in a very big way. And we will know by the end of June at the latest who is going to rule at that sort of conflict. And then we can start making predictions about who's going to win.
But if Russia is weakened, then it's clearly will be weakened by this entire conflict and increasingly isolated. Doesn't that pose a broader threat in terms of global harmony? I'll use that word. Or that if Russia is a weak, does it become a failed state? Does it become a narco state, an organized crime state? Is it the new Afghanistan? What does the future of Russia then look like, win, lose, or draw
It
in
looks a
Ukraine?
lot like the history of Russia, an inefficient state that's run by a kleptocratic, aristocratic class that oppresses everyone around it in a desperate attempt to find some security. I mean, this we've seen this movie before. We've seen it at least 11 times.
And so, well, and what does that mean? The gas flows ever then from Russia ever resume back into Europe,
No,
or is that over
the
then?
explosion in output that we saw since 1990 was largely because of British Petroleum, or I guess it's just BP now, and the Western services firms. They're all gone. And so we know that those fields are going to decay in time, independent of what happens with the sanctions or the tariffs or insurance. I don't want to suggest that Russia is going to go to zero, but the longer this war goes on, the greater the chance that there's going to be damage to the onshore pipelines, in addition to anything that the Europeans, the Americans, and the Japanese do. So we should all consider that anything value added coming out of Russia and anything raw commodity coming out of Russia is going to drop precipitously and in many cases suddenly. But we shouldn't expect on it to see much of any of it coming back within the next several years. Because again, the last time it took 30 years to rebuild the capacity, and that's when the West was very tightly involved. We're not anymore.
You mentioned, well, we've talked about commodities broadly, but yeah, I remember distinctly, I made notes on it. You talked about Russia and neon supplies. One of the other gases that is critical for industry is helium, and Russia is another big supplier of helium. So walk us through that. You talked about neon and the replacement supplies. This is another example of how Russia becomes irreplaceable in that. What about helium as well? Because that's needed in industrial processing. I wanted you to talk about those two elements, but if you look at the entire commodity space, whether it's rare earth elements, neodymium, terbium, whatever, neon, are there a handful of those that you look at as being the most constrained in terms of future supply?
I'm not concerned about rare earths at all. That's a processing issue. And the ore that produces rare earth elements comes from almost every mine in the world as a byproduct. So it's just a question of building out the processing capacity. And once the Chinese started to try to blackmail the Japanese a few years ago, a lot of countries, the US included, built out some of that processing capacity. So if there ever was a shortage, we could kind of switch some gears and within a few months have a domestic supply. So I'm not concerned about that. It's like the one thing I'm not concerned about. Industrial gases are a messy space because every gas has its own economics, but all of them are sourced from something called an air separation unit, which just takes the atmosphere and splits it into different chunks. Most air separation is done for oxygen and nitrogen as part of steel foundries, and that's no exception when it comes to the former Soviet Union. The problem is it requires a second stage of separation in order to get the trace gases like helium and neon. And that second stage is usually done at a different facility that's more advanced. And in the case of the former Soviet Union, where 80% of the stuff comes from, that second stage was largely done in Mariupol, and all the infrastructure has been destroyed. And for
Interesting.
those of you who don't know, helium and neon are the two critical components in semiconductor etching lasers. So we are going to have a massive global shortage in semiconductor fabrication capacity within a year.
Which means car manufacturing, among other things, will be much more constrained.
We're going to have to decide what goes back to analog for a while. It's going to take 2 to 3 years to build out replacement infrastructure somewhere else.
So Intel planning to build this multi-billion-dollar fab here in Taylor, Texas, just north of Austin, is going to be part of this reshoring in particular. But they're going to need these rare gas or these relatively rare industrial gases to make any of it work.
I need to pick that apart a little bit because it's yes-ish. Several companies, most notably Taiwanese ones, after the last scare we had with neon, which happened back in 2014 with the last Russia-Ukraine war, have invested a lot in recycling of the cartridges that have the neon and the helium, and they've made a degree of progress, and those recycling facilities are actually located in-house. So there are some technologies under development with this and different kinds of lasers to try to slim down the need. It's not happening fast enough, but it is happening. Intel's not reshoring. That's a fundamentally new technology that they're implementing at scale. And most of the high-end fab facilities that the Biden administration is encouraging fall into that category. The key to remember with semiconductors is there's different categories of quality. The high end that goes into servers and phones and computers, that was already done here, as well as in Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And so when we expand our footprint of this stuff, we're actually taking market share from allies. The low end, the Internet of Things, your smart light bulbs, that's all China.
Gotcha. So I want to, since you're talking about China, you're on YouTube. You have a very successful channel on YouTube. You're producing content all the time. I mean, you mentioned, by the way, when we met here in Austin, and I do a fair amount of public speaking. I had 40 engagements this year. You told me then you were doing 160 this year. Is that right? In calendar year?
Done like 15 since then.
But your total engagements this year will be 160 speaking engagements, something like that.
Oh no, I'm going to top 180.
180. So yeah. You've added 20
I'm
since
so
I saw
tired.
you. Okay, well, so that's the tee up for in this recent video about China. You were talking about Xi, and you said, and this issue of the information rate and a one man rule. And you said, I'm quoting you here, you said, a person only has so much bandwidth. How do you have so much bandwidth? I mean, I'm staggered truly because I get tired of hearing myself talk, and I can imagine hearing myself say, the same, you're not saying the same thing 180 times, but to do anything that much, you have a speaking engagement every other day. How do you do it?
Well, I've got a great team supporting me, and if I ever implied that this was all me, that was not what I intended. I apologize.
No, I know.
And my job is to figure. My job is to figure out how the world works and look at it through the eyes of everyone who is in front of me so I can explain to them the opportunities and the obstacles in front of them. I am not attempting to micromanage their business. There's a big difference between helping people see the world through a new angle and trying to micromanage a country of 1.4, or excuse me, 1.2 billion people. One of these is an easier test than the other, and I have very open lines of information and communication to the world around me, whereas Xi has built a wall.
So, well, you mentioned your team. So, how many people do you have? Zion on geopolitics as your firm? Is it an LLC? How do you what kind of entity is it?
Most of us are involved in research in some way. There's only half a dozen of us total, but then we, of course, outsource for people for contract work that do very specific things like graphics and web support.
Gotcha. So, but I'm truly am impressed by your output. I mean, how do you have a photographic memory? I mean, like I mentioned the book, and I've seen you speak. I've heard you on podcasts. I mean, the command that you have, and I'm not blowing smoke up your skirt here, but the command that you have over the amount of information that you deal with and the amount of information that you turn around and make your own and then produce as content is, I mean, I've been to, as my father used to say, a county fair and a goat rope, and it's damn impressive. How do you do it?
Well, I've got two things going for me. First of all, I'm a generalist. So it's all about drawing connections among different things. And every time I'm in front of an audience, I'm learning the world from a new point of view. You do that 180 times in a year, you got a book. And that's where the last one came from, to be perfectly blunt. Second, I've identified the weak points in the international system years ago as part of my previous work. And so now that it's all happening, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I can look at the work that we've already done in the past and say, okay, we identified these weak points. This one is in play right now, and that triggers these events. So from our
And
point of
that's
view,
the
the
way
hard
that you
work is behind us.
so that's the way you keep it fresh by saying, oh, well, then I pull this out of the file cabinet, so to speak, and say, well, this is what matters now because this is what happened then,
And
right?
this is what you can look forward to happening next because the next domino to fall has to be here.
Right. But I asked that question seriously. Do you have a photographic memory?
No, but I would actually argue that right now I'm full. It's like I have to I'm Johnny Mnemonic now. Like every time I put something in, something else has to come out.
Well, okay, I would imagine. So are you reading? Well, so just a couple more questions here because we're close to an hour. Um, so when you read books, of whoever, I mean, this is almost 500 pages. Are you reading other people's works and then digesting them and taking notes? How do you manage the inflow of
I
information?
used to. I have not had time this year. There has not been time. In the past, I was big on structure books or history books that studied overall trends. Like Silk Roads was one of my favorites because it, talked about this concept of geography and how it played across the national politics and economics of countries going back 25 centuries. I loved that. I don't have time for that kind of stuff.
So, well, so one of the questions I have guests introduce themselves, and then I always ask them toward the end of the interviews, what are you reading? Now, you mentioned Silk Roads. Who was the author of that?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask that.
No
Sorry, I
problem.
can't remember off the top of my
No,
head.
no problem. But so you said you don't have time. Or are you reading any books now, or what are you reading on a daily
No,
basis?
I have been on the road all but 7 of the last 95 days. So right now I'm not reading anything.
Gotcha. But if you were and aside from then, well, let me just press you a little bit. So aside from your own books, The Accidental Superpower, this one, what books would you recommend besides your own to people who are interested in the geopolitical space? Are there favorites of yours?
Oh, well, I mean, the two obvious ones are Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, which remains the best example of how geography shapes economic development going back to the beginning of human recorded history. Great book. You're going to learn a lot about chickpeas, just be prepared. But the intersection of climate and geography and axial trade is kind of the hallmark, and that kind of sets the stage for what's possible. And if you're looking for something that's on the complete flip side, World War Z by Max Brooks, not the movie was hot trash, the book. And yes, it's about zombies. I am not a zombie fan. I am not a Romero fan, but he takes the entire human condition and changes one thing and shows how it remakes military strategy and technology and finance and agriculture and culture. And it's an amazing case study of what could happen.
Good. Well, those are so is you mentioned guns, germs, and steel. Is that Did you use that as kind of a model for how you do things then? I mean, because it's the top of your list here. Is that kind of
Anyone who is in my space and says no to that question is lying.
because he set the stage, well, gave the
He
template
set the
with that.
stage for how it could be done, and the rest of us aren't copying. But wow, I don't think without his framework, we would all be able to think about things in the way that we do.
So you stole the idea.
I like to think I'm paying homage.
There you go. Well, it was it Picasso or John Lennon. They're both given credit for this line. Amateurs borrow, professionals steal. So there you go.
Well, like I said, I'm not standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm standing on the shoulders of everyone.
Okay, so last question, Peter, and Peter Zeihan's work can you be found pretty much everywhere. He's the author, most recently, of "The End of the World is Just the Beginning: Mapping the Collapse of Globalization." I said I was going to give you one question, but I have to ask this one first because people ask me, "Are you writing another book now? Do you have another book in mind? You're awful busy to do anything besides
My publisher
standing
is
on
leaning on
stage."
me very hard. I'm starting to noodle over it. Ask me again in January because I haven't had time to really flesh it out. But I'm playing with a few ideas.
Gotcha. So the last question, then, Peter, what gives you hope? We you no one would accuse you of being overly optimistic. Who's the what's the Doctor Doom? The guy from NYU. His name is slipping my mind right now, but your outlook on the world has a lot of cautionary notes. What gives you hope?
Well, we are looking at the end of the globalized era, and that means unwinding a lot of the benefits of the globalized era. And there's nothing about that that's cheery. But we're not looking at a systemic collapse of human civilization here. I mean, we've had a number of periods in human history where when the system broke, everything broke. I mean, Europe had a millennium long dark ages. That's not what we're looking at here. The American system is going to hold, it's going to expand, it's going to thrive, and it's going to reach out and integrate with other parts of the world that are also going to do well. And they're going to be secondary centers around the world. Think of France, think of Turkey, that are also going to do pretty well for themselves. This is not a vacation from history. This is an adjustment period. Now, it's an adjustment period that's going to last 30 years. But on the other side of this, technology is going to continue to advance. And when we get through this adjustment, it's not that we're going to pick up where we left off, but we will enter the next chapter of history. This is not the end. This is just a really, really bad shakeout.
And it's not going to last forever.
No.
Was Nouriel Rubini, the Doctor Doom from NYU. He's known as Doctor Doom. And I'm not suggesting you're Doctor Doom, but